Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the GED Testing Service webinar, Hitting the Mark, taking a deeper dive into reading. And this afternoon, I have with me Susan Pittman, and we will tell you that this afternoon we do not have at this point Daphne or Debbie, although Debbie's going to be coming with us a little bit later into the broadcast. Like in the past broadcast, all of you are muted, but you should be able to hear us. If you've got any questions as we go through, please note that you do have a question box. We're going to be monitoring that as we go through the webinar. And if you did not have the opportunity to download the handouts that came with your invite, you'll notice on the right hand it says handouts. Both the workbook and the PowerPoint that we're using today are there. So you may want to just download them because we will be referring to those throughout. So we're glad for those of you who were with us last month that you're back with us. We have a totally different workshop today, of course, and what we're going to be doing in this session is we're going to talk about strategies to enhance our students' close reading skills. Many of us in adult ed are not reading instructors, and yet reading is such a highly important skill that we really want to focus on that. We're also going to discuss the importance of close reading for different types of resources, not only the source text, but also graphics, and guess what, even good old math with word problems. And then, like in the past, we're going to be sharing some resources, some ideas, and of course some tips, some of them being in what Susan and I'll be talking about in a moment, and of course many of them in the guide. So let's talk a little bit about those similar skills and different content areas, because it really is important for us to remember that there are similar skills in reading and they are required across all 4 content areas of those GED tests. So Susan, let's talk a little bit about something called high impact indicators. Can you kind of review for us what those are?
Well, for those of you who were with us back, I think it was in either November or December, we talked a little bit then about high impact indicators. And so just as a review, and for those of you that this may be new, what you should know is that these are skills that are widely applicable. I mean, they're not just about the GED test itself, but things that our students can take beyond the test and use in real world situations. They really do lend themselves to straightforward instruction, and sometimes in the classroom we may not be covering those as well as we should be. Maybe we do a little bit, but maybe not as in depth. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look here at the issue, especially dealing with reading and how that crosses all different content areas. So let's take a look at one of those high impact indicators. And you notice that it's R for reading. So, and that's reasoning through language arts. Let's evaluate the relevance and sufficiency of evidence offered in support of a claim. And we usually measure this in informational text. Well, think for just a minute about how important that is. Now, I know when we see that, sometimes we say, oh, evidence and a claim, oh, that just must be about the writing part of the test. But no, it's really not. Any of the multiple choice questions, the technology enhanced questions, require that students be able to identify and evaluate that evidence if they want to get the correct answer. But take a look at that lower part of the chart and notice that we have some of the same things showing up in social studies, in science, and Bonnie, over at the end, look at that. We have it in math as well, where students have to recognize and identify missing information if they're going to solve a problem. It's all about close reading and being able to extract that information as it's needed, regardless of the test area that you're working in. So let's take a look. I think we can look at another one. Now, this again comes back to close reading. But this time we start out with something from science, those science practices. So can I, if I'm a student, read and identify that hypothesis that's involved in a scientific investigation? okay, if I'm going to do that, I have to do close reading, purposeful reading as I'm going through. And notice that if we look at the social studies practices down at the left-hand side, it's some of the same types of things where I've got to go in and I've got to dig for that information, pull that information out. And now same thing back again to mathematical practices. And once again, if we're going to identify a hypothesis, we may have to draw some conclusions and make some generalizations. All of those things are about close reading. And I think, Bonnie, we have one more slide that we're going to take a look at, and most of you will see this one at the very top and go, oh, yes, cause and effect. You know, that's one thing that some of our students have quite a bit of difficulty with. Well, sometimes that's because they're just not reading carefully enough. They're kind of doing that skim through trying to find an answer, but rather than reading with a little bit more depth. Or if I have to evaluate a conclusion and see whether it's supported by something. Or that last one, Bonnie, you know as well as I do, inferences is one of the most challenging things for many of the students with whom we work. They have difficulty seeing those things that are not explicit, but rather implicit. And so we have to take a look at how we can help students achieve those skills. And the way we do that is really to talk about close reading. For those of you out there who are have looked at research or you've been doing some things with close reading, you'll probably recognize the name Dr. Douglas Fisher from San Diego State University. He truly is an expert within that area of close reading, and I like the way he defines it. He says that that's really a careful, and notice that next word, purposeful, rereading of a text. Now, some of you will say, but Bonnie and Susan, it's hard for me to get my students to read once, much less reread. Well, we're going to talk about some ways that we can help students really come back to the importance and understand that sometimes that rereading is going to save them from making some mistakes that they just don't have to as they're working through. So let's take a look at close reading and what that really is. Now, there are lots of words here and lots of different things that we expect, but I want you to think about what you do, not when you're just sitting there reading a novel or something like that, but that you really have to read this and understand this informational text. You are very methodical. As an efficient and effective reader, you take a very methodical approach to how you look at complex text. And so close reading really gets back to unpacking that text meaning, which means that I could answer a question that wasn't my opinion, but was really based on the text that I had read. And it's also about making sure that our students know how to look at the words that are being used in the sentences, look at the events and ideas, and be able to extract that evidence from the text. These are some of the things that we really take for granted as effective readers, and we can foster that within our students itself. So Bonnie, why, I mean, we've talked a little bit about close reading and how important that is, but really what all is it going to do for us?
Well, Susan, let's face it, close reading isn't a skill that comes naturally as much as we would like it to with our students. And as you said, when our students get that new reading assignment, when they hit that test, their first instinct is just race through it. I just want to get to the end and see if I can find the answers. And so, first of all, we need to get students to slow down, because if they slow down a little bit and read for meaning, they're going to be much better off. Now, please don't hear me say that we want them to read word by word. Not at all. But we want them to read and what we call interact with the text. Because there again, if students can closely read, it's going to help them understand why they're reading something and promote those really important skills of critical thinking and problem solving. And of course, we all know that if I closely read, that can also click into my close hearing of what someone says and what I understand that they say. And it really is one of the main tools that's used in higher education and the workplace. You know, Susan, I can't imagine some of the things that you and I have to work with, that if you weren't doing a close reading of them, how little we would get done. I think about some of the grants you write. Wow, talk about close reading. Or for our students in the workplace and they have a manual or a handbook of how to use a tool. They want to do a close read. So it's really not only for higher ed, but it's a survival skill. And we have so much media that's clicking into us immediately that we really have to be able to look at all of those things very closely. Now, with research, we know there are some things that close readers do differently than those who are what we call not so close. And as you said before, close readers do reread. And if we think to ourselves about reading very complex text, I know that as I read it, the first time maybe is a little bit of a skimming through to get a big idea, but then I have to go back and focus on it. And I may even ask myself questions through it. That's what close readers do. And of course, paying attention to the words that are used, the language, either figurative or technical, so that I'm able to uncover that deeper meaning. But like all of us, we have those students who are not so close readers, and we see what happens. They read the text once, going towards the finish line. You can see that their thinking is just wandering as they're going through. Those are the readers who you watch them read, and pretty soon up pops the head, and off they go to the beginning again. The other thing is they take the text at face value. They don't ask themselves questions of what the author really is asking you to take back from it. And of course, they really do ignore some of the clues of reading, be it syntax clues, be it clues of organizational structure. And when they do that, they really understand only at the surface level. And we all know as we're looking at the 2014 GED tests that they need to dig deeper in order to understand the complex text that's written there. So we also know that there's a number of questions, because oftentimes our students will say, well, what do you want me to ask of myself as I'm reading? Well, part of it depends upon what they're reading. But when we look at these types of questions, they're not that difficult to integrate into our classroom, such as what's the mood or feeling of the text, especially if I'm reading something of a literary or fiction. I'll want to ask myself who's speaking. And even when I'm reading nonfiction text, is that speaker, someone I should be listening to, an authority? Even why? Why did the author write the text, and what exactly is it about? Of course, we want to look at chronological order. I can't think of reading a science passage without thinking to myself what goes first, second, third. And of course, the words, what's being said, and as Susan said, sometimes what's not being said, an inference. Who's the audience? How does one part relate to another? Again, chronological order. And what does the author mean? And I'll be the first to tell you that when I'd ask my students that question of what does the author mean, the first thing that popped out of their mouth was, how should I know what the author meant? I didn't write it. So again, we need to dig a little bit deeper. And in our classrooms, we really need to plan lessons on close reading across the different content areas. So as we plan for close reading, there is a process that all of us can implement into our classrooms, and we can use it in all the different areas. For those of us who are teaching multi-levels and oftentimes multi-content areas, it's wonderful to know that I can basically use one process, and it's going to work in reasoning through language arts with fiction and nonfiction. It's going to work with social studies, science, and guess what? It will even work with mathematical word problems. So as Susan and I talk you through the process, getting that process to work, We're just going to say a couple things to get started with. And number one, when you're teaching close reading, you're teaching the process, please use short passages. I laughingly say don't start out with War and Peace, but don't even start out with multi-pages, because that's when we get that student, rolling his or her eyes and saying, you want me to do what? Again, we want the process to work. And we're going to let our students guide the way by having them answer questions. And of course, we always want to keep discussions because close reading requires a lot of discussion. And sometimes our students want us to get off the track. So we want to make sure that our discussions are focused on the text, and whatever activities we develop are related to the text, not somebody's opinion. So when we look at putting the process to work, Susan, I see we have 5 steps here. So I guess that teaching close reading isn't just about rereading. There's a little bit more to it. So what do I do?
Well, it all starts with finding the right text. And that's something that in just a few moments we'll go through and we'll take a look at some samples that are out there. But we have to find, as Bonnie said, we want short passages. We don't want something that is multi-pages. First of all, we want the shorter pieces so that we can really dig down deep into the process and help students learn that process. But we're also going to have to go through, and there's some work that we have to do as we're going through, which is we're going to have to do our pre-work. Notice that step 3 says we're going to teach students to read with a pencil. That's another code kind of for annotations. And then we're going to talk about students' responses to TDQs. And Bonnie, I'm on mute for just a second.
And we're going to go to the next step and have our students write about what they read. A really important step as we're looking at the different types of constructed response, both extended as well as short answer, but also a real world skill. So let's scaffold or tear it apart. The first step is finding the right text, because we're not going to use this process with everything that we use in the classroom. So we want a text that has multiple purposes. Yes, it needs to be complex being for the level of reader we have. It needs to be content rich, so we're just not reading something for focusing on reading. It has to be short, and again, it has to be applicable for multiple purposes, because bottom line is we don't ever have enough time to teach the content, the big ideas that we want to in social studies or science. So why not use articles that get the big content ideas and teach the process of close reading at the same time? Now, we all know that we have to use primary sources because they're a really important part of civics and government. So here's a sample. It is Patrick Henry's speech to the Second Virginia Convention. And you'll notice that this is a fairly short text. It only has 2 paragraphs. It is a primary source. It's also a speech, so it gives me that possibility of teaching different text structures, and it happened during a time in history that's very, very important for our students to understand as we look at that date of 1775. So as I look at this specific text, I can say to myself, you know what? This would really be a good text for multiple purposes. It is complex. It provides multiple different ideas that I can also teach that little bit of civics, government, and American history. And when I look at it, it is going to require that my students do close readings. But it doesn't always have to be about social studies. I can also take a text in science. And here's a text that's dealing with Earth space science because it talks about the birth began in a young star. And when you look at all the different words of science that are here and the different concepts that are here, it's still short, but it's content rich. And again, it is complex text that I could have my students do a close reading because they'll get some big ideas of science. So again, just a couple possibilities of the kinds of text that we can do. But Susan, You said
Yes,
that once I find the right text, I have to do some pre-work. You're telling me I, as the instructor, have to do something?
I'm afraid so. However, it's really not that complicated because, as you said earlier, you really want to as the teacher, you really want to have an in-depth understanding of that text itself. Because if you're going to lead students through it, you really have to know that text. So while you're doing that, you create some text-dependent questions, things that students can't give an opinion about, but that they've got to go back and refer to the text in order to answer those questions. There's another thing you want to do. You want to look through that text, and Bonnie, you mentioned something a minute ago about vocabulary and some of the terms that were in there. You want to make sure that you identify some key words that you're going to discuss at some point, but this is not something where before students read, you're going to give them the words and do the definitions. This is about making sure that you hit into those different terms or the different vocabulary as you work through the text. You've also got to make a decision. Now, I know there are all kinds of annotation symbols out there, but you know what? We don't need all that. We need something just simple and easy to work with, and we'll show you what that looks like in just a few minutes. The other thing you're going to do is if you were looking back at that passage we had just a few minutes ago, in fact, Bonnie, could you move back one slide for me? And let's take a look back at that science one that we were just looking at just a minute ago.
And it should be there in a moment.
There we go. And notice that first paragraph. Bonnie, that's a little long in terms of as we're starting out this process with students. So what I might do is say, okay, I'm going to take this and I'm going to chunk that first paragraph into two parts. And what I may do is say, okay, I'm going to take those first 4 lines through where it says from time to time one proton runs headlong into another. And I'm just going to split it out so that I've made it 2 paragraphs. Now I know that may not be the proper way to do it grammatically. However, this is for the purpose of really reading the text. And so as I'm getting ready to work with my students, I would be reading 3 different paragraphs rather than just 2, and we'd take those pieces apart. This is simply for getting students used to the process as they're moving through. And last but not least, the other thing I want to do is anytime I'm doing a close reading, I want to make sure that students write about what they read. I want them to go back, and it might just be a sentence. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that's long and involved. Maybe it's just, a summary of what they've done or a conclusion that they've drawn from something. So that's what I'm going to try to do from there.
Now, Susan, someone asked, what in the world was a TDQ or text-dependent question? And so it really is a question that can be answered only if students read from the text. And it's the kind of question that when you're reading the test questions from the item sampler on the GED Testing Service website, you'll notice that unless students have read the source text, they can't answer the questions. It requires those higher order thinking skills. So as I write my own TDQs, I want to make sure that those kinds of questions should make my students think at those higher levels. Maybe they identify some key ideas or evidence in complex text. Maybe those questions require that my students make logical inferences or they draw conclusions. Or I think of some of the literary text where the question may talk about someone's character or what's the theme. Again, words, phrases that aren't right there in the text, but they have to interact. And maybe with the text-dependent question, I even have them engage in an argument based upon what the text says. When we look at constructed responses, again, either extended or short answer, students have to read the source text in order to engage in arguments, in order to answer the short answers or the one that's on scientific design. Those are really important kinds of skills. So what you're looking for are text-dependent questions. And as Susan and I have looked at many of the materials, you'll find that even the materials you're using for the current test are much better about asking text-dependent questions. Again, those are the questions that we look at that are important for close reading. Step 3, we start putting the onus on the students.
I really like this, because I think about it, and I have to laugh when I think about it too, because what do we do if you give a student a highlighter? What are they going to highlight, Bonnie?
Everything.
Absolutely. So we're going to try to teach students to not do that. And when we say read with a pencil, it really is about annotation. Now keep in mind, when students are taking the GED test, they have a highlighting tool. So they can highlight key points, ideas that they have as they're reading different text. So they should be taking advantage of that. And so it's just real simple. We're going to have students underline major points. And remember, we're going to model this for them first. We're going to take them through a text together so they see how we think through the process. We're going to have them highlight or circle some keywords or terms. And this is not necessarily those terms you picked out, but it's terms that students determine that they're not sure about. And so we can always make sure we go back and use those. And then, Bonnie, I just like to use 3 symbols. I question. If I got a question or something's confusing, then as a student, I would just put a question mark out to the side and I would kind of write down why I have this question. If there's something that, whoa, I didn't know that, that's surprising, I can put an exclamation point. And if I'm looking at something, I say, oh, that's evidence that supports a major point, then I just use an E. So it gets my brain really thinking in terms of, and at this point I'm really interacting literally with the text itself. So that's just something important to keep in mind.
And Susan, like you said, annotation is not about just merely highlighting, because that really is not annotation. Annotation is a note in any form. So that's what reading with a pencil is. Okay, that sounds pretty good, but I think you had 5 steps that we were talking about. So once a student has interacted with the text, then what do we do?
Well, at that point, we have to go through and we've got to answer those TDQs. Now it's time for them to put that to work. And they have to provide their answers, but I'm going to have them, as we're in the early stages especially, indicate where they found the answer. That's why it's important up front that we kind of number our paragraphs or the chunks of the text so they can show me where the answer is found. Because remember, I don't want this from their opinion or something they think or they feel. I want the evidence that is there in the text itself. So they're going to do that. And then last but not least, I'm going to have them write. And as I said earlier, certainly does not have to be something quite lengthy. It can be a sentence, it could be a short paragraph. Maybe there's some other things that I'm going to do that actually will take a little bit longer for students to work with. However, I'm going to build that over time. Remember, Bonnie, you said earlier this is a process. And so we're going to work at this, we're going to practice it, we're going to practice it some more, practice it again, because what we want to do is build the habit of close reading with our students so that no matter what kind of text they encounter at some point in time, they'll be able to handle it.
So this is more a unit of study plan rather than a single lesson?
Oh, absolutely. This is certainly something that you're going to want to do over a period of time where you take this and break it apart, just like we broke apart the text. You want to break this apart so that you're actually allowing students the time to take all this information in. You know, sadly, Bonnie, so many times we have so much in the adult ed classroom to do. I mean, we're talking about Many of us out there have multiple levels of students. We have multiple subjects that we're working with, and our students, they want their to pass their GED test today, yesterday, not even a week from now. They want it already done. And so we have to figure out how we can get this going. But the way that we truly can get students to improve their reading skills over the long haul is to take the time to do this process, get it in place, and use it consistently. I mean, that consistency is what most of our students are lacking, because they've learned one strategy, another strategy, and then now all the strategies are somehow confused in their head. So do you take some time, build over time, practice it with different types of text. Make sure that students get to do this with text that they enjoy reading. I mean, it doesn't have to be heavy duty social studies or science stuff. I mean, we can do this with sports articles. And I think later on we'll go through and talk about some sources for some text as well.
I think my husband has been doing real close reading now, trying to figure out which teams his team of choice for basketball is going to beat and what they're going to do. I think that's close reading in sports.
I think so. And, if you're going to set up, that whole bracket, you got to have done your work, and all your work up front in order to make sure you're filling in those brackets correctly. And then you never know when somebody's going to throw you a little curve in there.
So right. But I think we have provided one very basic on how to set this up for a primary source. So Susan, I'll have you go through this, and I'm going to pull up the workbook for them in just a moment to show them what it looks like.
Okay. What we have done is to actually take a speech from FDR, and it's an inaugural address, and we've gone through and how we would set that process up in working with students. And so this just gives you an example. So, and again, as you're working with words, sometimes you find that it's maybe a little bit messy in certain places. But what we've done is we have actually taken, and Bonnie will have this pulled up for you in just a second. Please don't get dizzy from watching her scroll. But this is an excerpt from FDR's first inaugural address. Now, as I looked at that excerpt, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, I think some of these paragraphs are a little bit too long for students, and I have to keep in mind this is a primary source. So that can also be a little bit more challenging to read. So I chunked the text and broke the different paragraphs. Some of them I broke into two pieces. So you can see, this is page 10 of your handout, what that looks like. Now, if we move on to the next page, then what you'll see there is that we have actually kind of done our own little setup of how it would look if a student was working with it, where the major points are underlined. There's some areas that are highlighted, maybe words or phrases that a student wouldn't know. There's examples, there's evidence. Notice that there are questions that we've inserted. So a student would have an opportunity, as we said, you work at this from one chunk of text at a time, and in that first chunk, a student has found a word, candor, that they didn't know. They have identified a major point, and then there is this E, evidence that there's hope for the future. And then we do the same thing. We repeat that process through each one of those chunks so that our students really are beginning to understand what FDR was saying in that inaugural address. So hopefully this will kind of give you an idea of how to work with this process and how you can use it with any number of different texts. This was just one example that we wanted to provide for you.
Okay. But you know what, Susan, it really isn't just about close reading of source text, because I can also take it into graphics. Sometimes we see editorial cartoons, photographs, etc. And as you can see, here's an example of a photograph where we've done some annotation. just questioning of what do I see, looking at the title and maybe I know this name and know that she was a famous photographer or photographer. I look at the background and I can see, really looks very, very dry. Maybe I heard once upon a time there was something called the Dust Bowl, and I noticed they're all females in this picture, and I wonder why all these females in the tent. Where's the father? Uh, I look at all of these things, and from that, I do close reading of a graphic of some type. And if your students are like Susan's and mine were, when they saw graphics, the first thing again they would do is just come to a quick conclusion. They wouldn't look at such things as the legends or the subheadings or the titles of something. They would just look quickly or sometimes not look at all. And we all know that on the GED test, there can be graphics that go along with source text. So students need to understand that close reading is more than just text. It is also graphics. And I can even look at a line graph, and I can ask my students after they've done a close read of it some basic questions that they're learning to interact with the text. Things that to you and me may seem just routine, but for many of our students, they've not gotten into the habit of interacting with graphics, so they've not gotten into the habit of asking important questions that close readers, effective readers, always ask. So as you look at these types of questions, again, easy enough, but there's no way that they could answer them unless they've looked at the graph. There's no way for them to interpret what it says unless they've come up with those basic ideas. And then you'll notice that last one, what can you conclude from the graphic? I could have used the word infer just as well, but conclude does work. And is there information missing? Now, Susan and I have talked a lot about, this is what we're doing in the classroom, but our students may say, okay, but what am I supposed to do? You say I'm supposed to interact with text. How do you want me to do that now that you've got your reading process planned? Well, with our students, once we have our lessons planned, we want our students to do 3 reads. We talked about that very briefly in the beginning, but the first read, we want them to get the gist. We want them to get the general meaning of the text. What do they think the purpose is? What's the text mainly about? What questions are you asking yourself, and what do you notice right away? And at this point, we want them to annotate those words that are unfamiliar. That's the first read that we want all students to take. And after we get through these 3 reads, I'm going to have you go back and think to yourself, do you do this? I have a feeling that you do, but sometimes we don't realize that because it just becomes automatic for us. When students do a second read, we want them to dig a little bit deeper, and this is where they're going to look at the craft and structure of the writing. We want them to look at text structures and text features because it helps for comprehension. We want them to identify the author's purpose. Is it to persuade? Is it to inform? Why is the author writing this? We also want to know how the author feels about the subject. Is there a passion for this subject? Is the author the expert in the field, so it's providing that information? And back to the words, why do we think that author used certain words and phrases, and what are some of those key words and phrases? What Susan called earlier, what's the evidence? What are the main ideas or central ideas? And we want another annotation here. Again, as we were looking, one of the things that we often see is our students don't know patterns of organization. If they could identify that during their second read, then they would know that, I'm reading something that's describing something. We see a lot of that in literature. Maybe in science, I'm seeing a process. So I'm going to see sequence and order. Or if I'm reading 2 texts or a text and a graphic, maybe I'm asked to compare and contrast. If I know that up front, then my second read takes on different questions. We talked about early cause and effect, something that many of our students have difficulty with, and yet we have lessons galore on causes and effects. Just they need to realize sometimes there are multiple causes, sometimes there are multiple effects. And then, of course, problems and solutions. Patterns of organization, an important lesson if you've not implemented a lesson plan on that already. Then the third read is really putting it all together. Integrating knowledge, ideas. This is where students, because they've interacted with the text, can make logical conclusions or inferences. This is where that evidence is provided that supports those key points. This is where I can also say, you know, this is a lot like something that I read before. Susan, I think it's some of the primary sources where if I'm reading something that's new to me, but I can say, you know, this is very similar to this source that my teacher had me read about in class, and I can now put it a little bit in historic context, and I can really understand. And then again, recording the ideas through annotation. So 3 reads, very strongly supported by research, but it's what we want all students to do. And if you think yourself about something complex you've read, I guarantee you've done those 3 reads, especially if you had to do something with the text. That first read to get the general ideas, sometimes we, you know, in the past would call it our pre-reading, and then reading through for that next time to dig a little deeper, and finally, to make sure that we've got it, that we truly understand what we're reading, to go back one last time and to get that integration of knowledge and ideas, as it says here, but to pull it all together. Now, not everything requires 3 reads, so put your students' mind at rest, but we'd much rather have students look at questions and then go and do multiple reads of complex text. Why? They'll get more answers correct, but more importantly, they'll better understand what they're reading. So,
Bonnie, we have a couple of questions that have popped in, and I think maybe this is a good point because they do go back and talk specifically about some of the 3 reads and annotations. And so one of those questions that we got from Christy Tatum is about close reading and annotation with an article on the computer seems to be more challenging for students. And so what's the recommendation there, Bonnie? Because I do know that I know personally for me that sometimes I like to see things in print, but the reality of the test is that they're doing things that are on the computer. So how could we practice some of that?
Well, as you said, we can highlight for specific ideas rather than the type of highlighting that oftentimes our students do. But the other thing is, remember that they always have those dry erase boards. And so some of those ideas can go down there. So we need to take that process of annotation and put it from the computer screen onto that whiteboard. And
that's a good idea, because as students are going through, and I think, Christy, from the standpoint of your question too, the big issue here is that we just don't, our students are not as proficient readers and as we need them to be. And so we're going to try to build these skills first. We will build most of them in the classrooms. We tend to work with print and work through that, but give them ample practice so this becomes more natural. Then what they can do is, yes, the highlighting tool is there for GED Ready and is there for the operational test, so they know that they're going to highlight just for specific things. So that's going to pull them away from it having everything highlighted. But they'll also be able to jot down some notes to remind themselves. And keep in mind, when we're looking at the test, you have paragraphs that are numbered. So if a student said, oh, I found evidence in paragraph 2, they could jot down a 2 and then what that evidence was. But the main thing is to get them kind of moving with the process so that it becomes more natural. As they start out, I'll be the first to tell you that it's pretty stilted. And in part because you have students who are very slow and laborious readers. So hopefully that will help some as they work with the issue. The other thing, Bonnie, the question came in from Megan Jones, was looking at how does the idea of reading a text 3 times work when they're under the time limit of the GED test?
And there again, remember that not everything needs to be read 3 times, but we're also looking for what we term a habit of mind. And so consequently, because of that, if they are practicing those skills in your classroom, then what's happening is slowly but surely, they're learning how to be effective readers. And so what becomes 3 reads in your classroom where you're really step by stepping it can be collapsed, or it will automatically collapse because they'll have those skills. When we looked at, the 10 questions that close readers ask themselves as they read, you'll notice there that some of those questions would have come from a first read, a second read, a third read. And consequently, they've been put together. And so that's what we're looking at. There's a difference between how we teach and that step-by-step or scaffolded process and what the end result is. However, having said that, if I have a primary source, some of these quotes that we see in social studies, they're not as lengthy, but I'm also going to say because they are so complex, after I've read some of those questions, I may need to go back and do the 3 reads, that first time through, the second and the third. There's one other thing, and this really is important as we work with students. Susan and I have worked with students for years, and we know they're slow and methodical readers. If students are reading at approximately 100 words a minute, they're not reading with understanding or comprehension. Most of us read at the level of readability we have at least 300 words with understanding. So again, the 3 reads also get held up. If we have students who are reading word after word after word. And Susan, I think there's a strategy that you and I have used, plus many of our teachers that we've worked with, to help with that fluency a little bit, because I have a feeling those 3 reads and fluency can be a problem child.
Well, it can. And the main thing that everything, to become a better reader, what you have to do is you have to read. And the more you read, the faster you will begin to read. The research is really clear that you have to have a certain speed at which you're reading to really get that meaning to coalesce around those words. You move from you reading individual words to reading groups of words, which is how you do that when as an effective reader. But one of the things we recommend for everyone out there is to please make sure that you know how long how fast your students read. And you can do a quick timed reading activity. There are a number of different things that are on the web that you can use, or you can just take a passage, give students 1 minute to read that passage, see how many words they read. So that's just a real quick and dirty way to do it. But there are different materials that are available out there that you can use just for that purpose of improving the speed at which you read. Now, please do not hear us say that students need to be speed readers. They need to be competent, effective, efficient readers, which puts them somewhere in that 250 to 325 range of words per minute. That way they're getting the meaning and they're able to go back through. So even if a student has a passage that's 900 words, that's 3 minutes to read it. If a student is actually reading at 100 words a minute, well, first of all, they're going to get lost within the first couple paragraphs. But the other thing is they're just not going to pull the meaning, and that would be 9 minutes to read something. So first we've got to work on that issue with speed, with the speed at which they read. And a lot of that comes from practice. And we also talked about the fact that, make sure you start with short text. And the text that we were looking at, the FDR and looking at some of the other things, Bonnie, we were probably looking at what, about 300 words, somewhere 400?
Somewhere in
Within
that
some of
neighborhood.
the, yeah, I mean, we don't want it so short that it's just a paragraph. And then you just begin to lengthen that out as you work through the process. But again, you want to make sure that students understand the process. So I would stay with text that's around 400 words in length, maybe for the first couple of things that I did with them. And then I would expand it out a little bit more. As they learn the process and they get comfortable with it, what you're going to find is that they're going to get past some of the blocks they have in reading. One of the reasons our students don't read is reading is uncomfortable for them, and they don't know how to approach material they read. This gives them a how-to, and if you as the teacher model it, you're going to find students are going to be doing much better as they move through. So we'll make sure that one other question here, Bonnie, we had from Nicole Royal, and she says, are you talking read aloud or to themselves? It's to themselves. Reading fluency is reading aloud, but reading rate is actually reading to themselves, because you automatically, when you are saying the words out loud, you automatically slow yourself down. So we want to see how students are reading to themselves.
And one last thing before we continue is remember, as we're going through the process that we're talking about today, we're also looking at teaching content. It's a combination of not only understanding what you read, but also having some content knowledge that also goes in. And so we do need to know our students, and we don't want to frustrate them. So that's why Susan and I keep saying, don't worry about, oh my goodness, when do I go from 400 to 900 words? Because we all know that on the GED test, there are many different types of word lengths on the articles that are there. And sometimes those longer articles have multiple questions. So it's not like if there's 20 questions, they're having to read 20 different passages. The other thing is, by teaching them to become a closer reader, they start looking at what questions are asking and what the source texts are, because we all know that there are some questions they don't read the source text, but rather read the source graphic. So lots of different things play into this, but the process and the 3 reads are for deeper understanding and deeper learning. So
which also means, Bonnie, that with that deeper understanding, it's going to come more questions answered correctly.
We like
that's
that.
a really good thing, you know. So let's talk, because I know that we're running a little bit longer here today with some of the things, but let's talk about close reading and math, because, you know, hey, math is math. It's numbers. It's not words. Well, yeah, it's a lot of words. It's a lot of word problems. And just notice the things that we have here. There's our 3 reads again, Bonnie. And just like the first one, you said they kind of get the gist. So they're reading for understanding. Then in their second read, they're looking at, okay, what ways could I possibly solve this problem? And then you hit the third read and you've actually done the math. I know students want to do the math first thing, but you've done the math, and now you go back and read to say, oh, did I do this? Did I answer the question? Is my answer reasonable? Or, as we were talking yesterday with some teachers in doing problem solving, and one of the students says, oh, I've got the answer, it's 2.5. And the teacher said, I want you to think about that, because what did it ask you for? It asked you for the number of people. And all of a sudden the student says, oh, I can't have 2.5 people. So it's those types of things that make a difference. So let's take a look at what that means. In that first read, there is an issue here that we have with students in vocabulary and in math of, what vocabulary do I not know? There are a number of words out there that students have problems with, the terms that they have difficulty with, and we're going to talk about some resources for that. What's the real world context? Keep in mind, the GED test really is built around real world situations in math. And so, you know, this is about the situation, not just the math skills that are needed, and also looking at those questions that are being asked. Now, we talk vocabulary. There are certain things that we need to do with students, and that is that we need to do a little work with vocabulary. And I want you to think in terms of the fact that basically there are 3 tiers of words. And that first tier, those are those everyday things. Students are familiar with them because they hear them in conversation. You know, those are all the basic words. But then you get to tier 2, and here's where some of our students start having difficulty, because we call them I love the terminology, high utility academic vocabulary, which means that I can use these words across lots of different content areas. And then the top tier is domain specific. So if we're talking math, we're going to look at some words that are those tier 3 words. They're very specific to math. So Bonnie, let's look at an example of tier 2. Take a look at this, because now this came from Vocabulary for the Common Core. There is another one that you can take a look at. It's called the Academic Word List. It's out of the University of New Zealand. But these are the words that could appear anywhere, not just in math. They could be in social studies or science or reasoning through language arts. But our students need to know these words. More importantly, they need to own them. And by that I mean that they can use them in different types of situations. This is just a sample. There are, of course, a lot more words than this. But I want you to think about what it would mean if a student didn't know some of those words. However, now we're talking about reading and math. And do your students know what additive inverse is? Do they know absolute value? Those are those tier 3 words that are specific to math, or if you look at dependent, independent variables, Bonnie, I think those show up over in science as well.
I think so.
And it could end up in some graphic literacy as we're going through. But again, tier 3, some vocabulary that you can look at from that standpoint. So you may want to use the URL that's there and take a look at those types of words, and do your students own them? The other thing that Bonnie and I will recommend is, if you don't have a copy of the Reading Teacher's Book of List, and we'll put that into the chat box for you, the Reading Teacher's Book of List, which is from Fry, and I'm sure most of you have heard of the Fry list of vocabulary, which is all those basic words. But that is an excellent resource for you as a teacher, because it gives vocabulary across all content areas. It provides activities, but a great resource. So keep that in mind. So that first one there, when we did our Read for Understanding, we got to make sure our students know the vocabulary. But Bonnie, there's another thing they need. When they've got all that information together, they've read that problem the first time, they got to do some thinking. And it's about, what are some strategies that I could use? How could I go about solving that problem? And how am I going to represent it? You know, there's a lot of symbols in mathematics. How do I set that problem up? And which things am I going to need from that word problem that will let me solve this? Those are things that happen on that second read. Now, for those of you who have been around for a while, like Bonnie and I have, there's one little tool out there that everybody knows, and it's a KWL. And we have that worksheet that we use for lots of different things within the classroom. Well, thanks to Claire Heidemann out of the Ohio Resource Center, there is a new problem-solving strategy. There's a graphic organizer that Bonnie and I really like, because it's pretty simple, but it does require that students do a close reading of a problem. That's called KNWS. Now, as you look at that, what you may say is, I think I need that W first. Well, then it wouldn't be close to KWL. So we can answer these in different orders. But look at those questions. That would require that I go into that problem and really give a close reading to it. So Bonnie, can you show us real quick how that works?
Definitely. Let's say we have a question like this: Video Online rents movies for $3 per night. And they also offer a max movie plan for $100 per year, with 2 free rentals per month and unlimited rentals at $1 per movie each per night. Last year, Deidre watched 46 movies. How many movies must Deidre rent in a year to make the club deal worthwhile? Okay, I've done my first read and I have no clue what it says. So let me go ahead and do this second read. And my second read, the first question I want to answer is, what does the problem want me to find? Well, it wants me to find how many movies must be rented in a year to make joining the club worthwhile. Then I'm going to take a quick look and see what facts I know. Well, I know there's $3 to rent one movie. I know the club plans 100 annually, and that each movie under the plan is $1. Okay. Now, is there information that I don't need to know? Oh, as I take that second read, I noticed that Deidre watched 46 movies. So, you know what? I don't need that information, even though most of my students would say, okay, that number's there. I have to do something with it. Well, then as I look at this plan, I'm going to say, how am I going to solve it? What strategies? Well, maybe I'm going to make a chart, or maybe I'm going to write an inequality. That may work for me. So I've done my second read using a word problem. Didn't take me too long, and it didn't take me long because I know that there's lots of problem-solving strategies out there I can use, so I just kind of clicked from my brain what I thought may work. Well, now I'm ready, Susan, for my third read. I understand that problem's content, so how am I going to use my math skills? Well, I'm going to use one of those problem-solving strategies. I'm going to solve the problem, and I'm going to quickly loop back to make sure that I've answered the question correctly. I've done my 3 reads. And Susan, I have a feeling that if we could get our students to slow down and do this with math problems, that we would have math that was done correctly. We wouldn't have that 2.5 students. In fact, Susan and I have shared this with many teachers, and they said it's been the easiest route to slow their students down and to really get them to, first of all, identify the information, the problem, but then to identify different strategies they can use and to solve it correctly. 3 reads doesn't take a whole lot of time because it very much becomes automatic, but it increases effective readers and it increases correct answers. So 3 reads, regardless of where it's source text in the written word, whether it's graphics or whether it's word problems. What do you think, Susan?
Oh, I think that works. I mean, it's something that our students can hang their hats on. It's something they could depend on. And it is a habit that they can form. And I think as they see success and they begin to feel more comfortable with reading, they're going to start reading more, which means that their reading rate's going to increase. And that's going to be the shining star we're sitting out there for, is to make sure our students have those skills, because they need them for the GD test, yes, but they really need them in real life too, when they go into the workplace, or if they decide they're going on to take a technical training program, they're going to need those types of things. So let's kind of sum up what we've learned today about close reading. If you work with close reading, it's going to strengthen your students' critical thinking and problem-solving skills. And that's a key element in student success on the test, as well as move on into real life. It allows them to enhance that content understanding because it's relevant. We're putting it into things that they can relate to, that things happen in real world. But it also engages them with new perspectives, new ways of looking at different things. And most of all, our students are going to be able to develop that ability to read complex text independently. And for all of you out there who are avid readers and you are always wanting to learn things, think how much you depend on that ability to read complex text and what it has meant to you. So let's take a look very briefly at a couple of online reading materials that you may want to access. These are just 4 different ones that you can find. If you want to learn more about close reading itself, the one in the lower right-hand side, the Aspen Institute, has a digital resource library that is loaded with professional development modules relating to close reading and engaging in academic writing and so on. So great resource for you as a teacher. As you're in the classroom, you may want to look at Newsela, which Bonnie and I have talked about before, or pro-con. Both of these provide places that you can find different topics that are interesting to students, that can get them engaged in reading. Remember, everything does not have to be about some academic text. We want them to learn how to do the process. We can work with a number of different types of material in order to do that. And if you notice up in the left-hand corner, the Annenberg Classroom. Bonnie, what a wonderful resource that is for so many different things. And here, there's an online Constitution course, and our students need an understanding of civics and government. So what a great way to be able to access some of those types of things. But
I was going to say, we do have the URLs for you, so don't worry that you're not going to be able to find some of these things. We will share those with you before we leave you today. But as Susan said, before we take questions, Daphne and Debbie have asked that we just share a few test-taking tips each session, because that's one of the things many of you have asked for. Are there test-taking tips to help my students? So this is our first little set of them. And the first test-taking tip is, please teach your students to read the questions first and identify helpful hints. Please do not hear Susan and me saying they should read the questions and go find the answers, because this is more complex text. But if they read the questions first, it will set the stage for what they're going to be reading in the source text or the graphics. Or one of the questions that I remember working with a teacher as Susan and I were out doing a workshop, the teacher said, my students don't have enough time to read all of that information for the short answer on science. And when you looked more closely at the text, and when you looked at the question, it was asking them not to read the source text, but to refer to the graphic. And consequently, it really didn't take that long, but had the student read that question closely first, it would have set the stage for reading the source text or graphics. So read the questions first and identify helpful hints. The other thing we know is useful is for students to predict an answer before they look at the answer choices. Again, covering the answers, things such as math, if they have done the problem solving and they've come up with an answer, that they know the answer first, and then they look at the answer choices. The same thing goes with reading the materials and the other three tests. Can they predict what the question is asking for an answer? Then they can look at the answer choices, see whether their answer is there. If not, then they need to go back and do a closer reading. You've heard Susan talk a lot about annotation tools, and hopefully, if we've taken them through the process of how to annotate, that highlighter really does become an annotation tool, not just a tool that I end up with this whole yellow page of script, but also remember that the whiteboards are there, that they can write short notes, and that will help our students more effectively analyze and evaluate what they're reading. The other thing that we can't push enough is we want our students to answer every question. But like all of us, when students often start reading a question, it's extremely difficult or complex. Sometimes they focus so much on that question, they run out of time or have to breeze through questions that they could have gotten had they had that little extra time. Remember, the GED test assesses different levels of skills. So some of those questions are going to be more difficult for your students because they're at the college career readiness level or the college career readiness with credit level. So when that happens, have your students get used to flagging them so they're not taking too much time to figure them out and going back to them at the end of the test. Also, with a number of tests that are out there, students may have heard that there was a penalty for answers. On some tests, there are. On the GED test, however, there is no penalty for an incorrect answer. So teach your students that if it's a multiple choice, that as they look at those answers, oftentimes they'll be able to deduce that, this can't be the answer and this can't. Well, even if they're guessing, that gives them a 50% chance with 2 left over to get the correct answer. So again, make sure that they are answering all questions. So a few test taking tips to get us all started, with more to come at webinars coming your way in the next months. So, Susan, having said that, I know we ran a little bit longer, and we will, before we leave you today, quickly go through your guide because it's full of resources for you. It's full of graphic organizers that you can use in the classroom, knowing that everything that is there, again, is applicable to what you're doing in the classroom. But again, you can download it and use it with your students. But before we do that, Susan, do we want to answer questions?
I think so. So Teresa, are you with us? And I think Teresa is self-muted, so she'll need to move from there for some of the questions. But one question that did come through was the fact that is that highlight feature available on both ready tests and the final test? And the answer for that is yes. So make sure students, they have an opportunity to practice that as they're going through. So
Hey, Susan.
hopefully that,
Hi, this is Teresa. Sorry, my mute button was acting funny.
I understand.
I actually just checked with the assessment team, and the highlighting is not currently available on the GED Ready online practice.
Okay. But, all right. So it's just the operational test then?
Correct. And it's available on all screens of the operational test.
Okay. Thank you so much for finding that out for us. And I apologize to those of you that I gave you the wrong response on that. So thank you for Teresa for going and following up. So do we have some other questions, Teresa?
We do. We have a question from Linda, and she has some students who English is a second language for them, and they do not read very well. She said repetition is what she uses a lot, but do you have other ideas?
Well, when you're working with ESL students, the repetition is really important, and it's also about building that vocabulary over time. So that's going to make a difference. But I really do believe that even with our students who are functioning at those lower levels, and our ESL students as they're kind of transitioning in, that it's important that we start that process of timed readings with them so that they can build their reading skills over time. But another thing we need to do with our ESL students too is look to fluency. And I know that's a little bit lower level than where we are with the GED test, but within ESL populations, we really need to know how they're processing the information, the intonations they're using, and how their fluency is, because you know as well as I do that fluency is going to show how you're taking in that information, and you may be missing some pieces, if it's very flat, and as opposed to being able to read with more understanding and working through from that angle. So we have several different things, but the bottom line to so much of this is practice, practice, practice. And I know from a lot of people that a lot of ESL teachers that Bonnie and I have talked to, they said one of the greatest things in the world for working with students, ESL students, is closed captioning on TV so that they can hear the sounds, what's being said, as well as read the words. And a lot of people do some practice from those areas. So hopefully that'll help as well.
And we also had a question about the resources you shared just a minute ago, if there are any that are available in Spanish.
Yes, there are some resources that are available in Spanish. Of course, everything on the GED testing service site, which goes to students, is also available in Spanish. And just because I know a couple questions came through on how do you teach students to highlight on the test, how do you do this, know that there are tutorials out there. a tutorial for nothing but, for lack of a better term, the functionality of the test. How do you highlight? How do you do this? How do you do that? And it is in both English and in Spanish. Also, you are able to either have students view that online, or you can download it. Sites such as Newsela, many of those articles can be translated or translatable from the site into Spanish. Susan and I really like that site because not only does it have text-dependent questions, but it also has really interesting articles in social studies and science in lots of areas. It gets them into real world, what's happening in the world today. The other thing we like about that is it's also very good for ESL, ELL students because they're getting a different type of reading, and because they come in different lexile levels. You could be teaching a GED prep course, but if you have a multi-level classroom, you also have ABE students, you can have them reading the same articles, but at different lexiles. So all of those kinds of things are great resources for you.
We also had a question. Dora asked about 10 questions a close reader asks him or herself. She thought that you had referenced it, but wasn't sure where that was in the presentation.
It was towards the beginning, and there were 10 nice little boxes. So it was one of the more of the beginning slides, and when you download, I think you'll see those very quickly.
Okay. Another question that came in, you spoke about starting with a short text and then moving into longer text. Is this a gradual process? How do you know when your students are ready? And then do you do anything differently as the paragraphs increase?
Yes, it's a gradual process. Yes, I would continue to chunk paragraphs, but also remember that there's no magic in going from a couple paragraphs to 10 paragraphs. As students get used to reading longer articles, you should still come back and forth. It should be the usability of the article more than the length. If you're really working towards that GED level, again, 900 words gets to be lengthy enough, but if you've got an article that's wonderful at 450, it's complex, etc., quite honestly, don't worry about it. But we do want to get students used to reading longer articles. A complex text at 450 words gets a whole lot more usability than something that doesn't have content richness that's at 1,200 words. So gradual release, yes, but also back and forth between lengths once they're able to read more lengthy passages.
We also had a couple questions come in about helping students who read slower because of vision problems or they're special education students. Do you have any suggestions for helping those students?
Susan, my first thought is accommodations. Make sure that if they are exceptional ed and have the ability to get an accommodation such as time and a half, that you do so. Realize that students, if we're looking at the fact that their sight, they have difficulty with the size of the font. Font can be increased on this test without an accommodation. But again, if I have a severe learning disabled student who has the right to get an accommodation, you'll want to look at that on the GED testing service site and figure out how to get that for your students.
And someone who has a vision problem, a lot of times the physical disabilities, it's a little bit faster in order to get everything processed for someone with a physical disability. So you may want to check into that. But in terms of any disability, just keep in mind that we not only look for accommodations for when students test, but we need to make the accommodations in the classroom to make sure that we're consistent across the board in providing that. But if you look on the GED Testing Service website, you'll see a lot of information on disabilities and how to be able to access information on getting accommodations. So please take advantage of those. Our students need that, and we need to make sure that we're advocates for them in the process, because sometimes they just don't know what all that they really need and what all they're entitled to.
Okay, we had another question. Do you feel it is necessary to break down or scaffold abstract terms like the terms topic, main idea, patterns of organization, or talk about reading as a whole and without the terms?
Susan, I'm trying to figure out exactly what they're
Well,
asking.
I think if I'm understanding that, then what we're looking at is I would introduce topic first and just work with that, and then I would begin to add other pieces to it. That certainly can work for students and being able, especially those students that we have so many students who are ABE students, and they may need some of that where we focus in and they're reading a passage, and all we really want them to be able to do that as we go through that day is just work on identifying a central idea. We don't want to go into evidence that supports that. We just want to find a central idea. And then we begin to add other pieces to that. So scaffold from that direction. So yes, you can do it both ways. Scaffolding for those different components, but also scaffolding in terms of, you know, the multiple reads and the things that we're doing. So hopefully that helps. I think I understood the question, but you know, I won't promise you. So.
And we had a request for you to briefly explain how to teach students to read with a pencil again.
Oh, okay. Bonnie, why don't you, while we're doing that, while I'm talking about that, go ahead and pull up the workbook for us, just so we can then go back and show people where all the resources are. When I'm teaching students to read with a pencil, what I do is I have already broken down the text, and I've numbered the paragraphs. And at that point, I take it a paragraph at a time or a chunk at a time with students to go through and say, okay, in this first chunk that we're reading, I want to know, you know, what do you find as the central idea of that chunk of text? What do you see? Are there any words that you're having difficulty with? Because what we're doing is we're building it over time. We're working our way through that text. But what I also want students to do is, as Bonnie indicated earlier about the 10 questions, I want students to start asking themselves those questions. So as they're reading, and for example, the FDR, and it says, all we have to fear is fear itself. I might have a student who would say, what do you mean being afraid of fear? And what does that mean? So that student is just going to annotate that by putting a question mark and saying, I don't understand. Because then what we do as a group is go back and talk about it, and put it into real world terms. But it's really about getting students used to taking text and interacting with it. If they see something and they're surprised, again, I'll refer back to FDR. There's a whole host of things in there that if you didn't know the date that this speech was given in 1933, you would swear it's something that happened in 2008 or 9. And so students actually, they look at this and they go, wow. And that would be where my exclamation point is. This is just like today, you know, with unemployment and low wages and so on. So they're beginning to make connections. It's a simple process for getting students, or I should say a simpler process than a lot of the other annotation tools that you see out there. But again, it's about getting students to go back to what Bonnie talked about early on, and that was those 10 questions. They begin to ask themselves that. So hopefully that helps. And I see Bonnie has that material moved up. So let's do a couple more questions and then we'll come back to the workbook itself.
Okay. But we have a couple questions about, does the test come with a calculator?
Oh, there's a calculator. There is a calculator that's actually on the computer that students can use. but also students are allowed to use a handheld Texas Instrument calculator there in the testing room itself. Now, it depends on the individual testing centers. Some centers provide those, some require that their students bring them in if they're going to use the Texas Instrument 30XS multi-view. So it's on the computer, but it's also one that they can have a handheld if that's more comfortable for them.
And Susan, we have just a couple questions on the test that I think we can pull together, and because we have a number of questions on, are the questions at the back of the test more difficult? And no, they're not. The test questions from RLA 1 to RLA 3 just basically go, in random order. So that's not a problem. That's why we were talking about the fact that when students look at things, they could see a very difficult question as question 2 and followed by a less difficult one. And except for the constructed response, the RLA questions are all worth the same points, with the exception of how students may look at some of those drop downs that are dealing with language, where there could be multiple drop downs for them to deal with language on the same passage.
Yeah, just keep in mind that, when students are reading passages in RLA, social studies, or science, sometimes there are multiple questions that go with that one passage. So maybe there is a passage there that's 600 words, but there's 4 questions that go along with that. And maybe one of those questions really is higher order, but that doesn't mean they couldn't answer the other 3. So Bonnie's tip that she gave earlier about, if there's one where they look at it and go, whoa, I just don't see that, flag it, and then if they have time at the end, come back to it. But I would much rather do that than to have missed having 2 or 3 real simple questions right after that. So keep that in mind.
And we're going to reinforce the fact that Teresa has put to the entire audience the computer-based testing tutorial and how you access that, and that will answer your questions of how do you highlight, how do you do all the different functionality of the test, how do you make the font larger, smaller, etc. So if you'll go out to that tutorial, I think you'll find it extremely useful, and we'd strongly recommend that all of your students go through that a few times so that as far as functionality, they're very comfortable with it.
Oh, and that was one of the things, because they'll learn how in that tutorial how to flag a question. So, yes. And that's very simple as they work through all of this. So, Bonnie, before we lose all of our time here, could you very quickly at least show people what some of the resources are within the book itself?
Okay, I'm going to make them dizzy for a moment.
Okay, that's okay.
And let's see how quickly they can see it on the screen here. All right, in your booklet, you have a number of resources. We start out with just an overview of close reading, just to give you a little bit of a focus. We've given you a graphic on nonfiction text structures that come along with the definition of each of those, some signal words for your students to look at, and what graphics. Sometimes our students do much better with graphics. So a little bit of information on text structure. We've also given you 5 simple strategies on how to read complex text, which goes along with the process that Susan was talking to you earlier about. We also have provided just what we would term a sample annotation guide. There's many things that you can use with your students. We really strongly believe that keeping it simple works very well, but we also know that some of you and many of your students would like to have something in writing of what kind of annotations that we feel would be very useful. We've talked about the FDR speech, and you have that information there, so you're going to be getting dizzy for just a moment as I scroll very quickly through. We've also, in a Word document, provided the 3 reads and what students should be doing with those 3 reads. And then we've also given you some sample reading strategies. These are going to be very familiar to you, but we've tried to give you some sentence starters so that as students are doing connections or predicting, what are not only some questions that they can use, but also some questions that you can use in the classroom with them. Text-dependent questions was something new to a few of you. And so we've given you just an overview. It's something that won't be new very long because we see those lovely TDQs everywhere we go. So again, gives you an idea with a graphic of the fact that if you are working with lower level students, you may start text-dependent questions at the word level. So for many times our ESL, ELL, /ABE students, that may be where we're at. But if you even look sometimes on certain questions that we've seen on the item sampler in the GED test, there's times when it will ask, what is the meaning of a question in context? Or a meaning of a word in context, sorry. And then for those of you who really like that KNWS graphic organizer, we've provided it to you as a graphic here that feel free to use it with your students. We found this one to be really a simple resource. Then last but not least, we've given you just a few resources to get started with. And no, the Annenberg one is not there, so we apologize for that, but would strongly just recommend that you go out to the Annenberg Learner because there are so many resources out there. So that is what you have in your document. And of course, last but not least on that document is the GED testing service, which continues to just fill their website with so many materials that are useful for us in the classroom.
And as far as the foundation goes, it's actually at learner.org. So I just put that together for you. So that's an easy one to remember and has lots of different resources that are available out there.
As we come to a close, because our time is coming to an end, please know that you will get a printout certificate for PD credit from this workshop, just like all the other webinars that we do. But also please know that all of the webinars are on the GED Testing Services website. They are archived there along with the materials. And as we go through for the next webinars, they are going to be very much instructionally based with hopefully materials that you find usable in your classroom. Susan, any other questions that we do need to cover before we close out?
I want to do one very quickly because we did have the question coming in again, how many words are on each passage on the RLA test? And the passage links vary as they do on social studies and science. They can run anywhere from 400 to 900 words. You're going to probably see more of them in the lower end than you are the upper end. But again, it's a range. So there's not a set number for each one of them. And then one other thing is from the extended response, students can earn a total of 6 points on the RLA test for the extended response. It is weighted. That is a question from Patrick Jordan. And what you do is take the 6 points, multiply by 2, which means the maximum score would be that they could earn as many as 12 points from that. So it is a weighted question. So hopefully that helps. Any other questions that we have that we didn't get to, we'll make sure that we go through and, you know, some of these, we can post those to the FAQs and those types of things. Bonnie, if you would switch one more, go over another slide, please. And if you do have other questions, please make sure, you know, if you've got a question you want to ask about the GED test, send that question to communications@gedtestingservice.com. That is that last email address at the end, and they'll be able to answer your question or add it to the FAQs, and that information will be available to everyone.
Okay. I'm going to do one more because she has asked it twice, and that is we want to make sure folks know that there is not narrative writing, but as we were talking today about literary text, things such as character, theme, etc., can be asked in a variety of other different question types. But we are going to close this with constructed response on RLA is indeed writing about what they read and to source-based text. So having said that, thank you very much, everyone, for being with us today on the GED Testing Service webinar. We will be back next month. And as Susan said, if you have any questions, please contact GDTS at these two websites. So having said that, Susan, anything else?
Just for those of you who have not yet had spring break, enjoy it when you do. For those of you who are back from spring break now, I hope you had a great time. But we look forward to seeing each of you again as we come in April. So have a great day. And Teresa, I'll turn it to you.
Oh, well, just to let everyone know that we will be sending out an email that will include the certificate of completion for you to download and print. Also, if you haven't gotten the materials, it will be included there, and a recording for you to watch the webinar again. We've been recording this, so that will be available. So with that said, thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoyed the webinar.